Donald Trump has set a date for full-blown economic warfare, August the 1st. Washington has been sending warning letters to several countries over the past few days. If we don't reach a deal by August 1st, I'll hit you with these tariffs. There's 25% on Japan and South Korea, 35% on Canada, another 30% on Mexico, and the biggest one yet, a 50% tariff on Brazil. However, the tariff that's grabbed the most attention is the one on Europe, a 30% tax on all products. The reason? Well, Trump couldn't have made it any clearer. Just take a look at the letter he sent to the President of the European Commission.
Please understand that the 30% number is far less than what is needed to eliminate the trade deficit disparity we have with the EU. As you are aware, there will be no tariff if the European Union or companies within the EU decide to build or manufacture product within the United States.
The excuse is the same as always, the infamous trade deficit. But once again, it's just that, an excuse. Case in point, the US has a $7 billion trade surplus with Brazil, and yet it's threatening them with the highest tariff of all. So what's the real story? Trump is using tariffs as a political weapon. In Brazil's case, he wants them to stop the trial against former right-wing President Jair Bolsonaro for that attempted coup a couple of years ago. And deep down, this gives us a clue. This whole strategy of threatening with tariffs might just be a big bluff, with purely political goals behind it. Think about it this way. Trump has promised to put an end to this whole trade war drama by early July. Everything seemed calm. And then boom, he kicked the can down the road again, this time to August the 1st, doubling down and threatening tariffs of 30 and 50%. It's not the first time he's pulled a move like this. With Trump, tariffs are a constant back and forth, but this strategy has a short shelf life. If he keeps playing this game, eventually, even if the threats sound serious, no one will take them seriously. So sooner or later, the president will have to stop bluffing and make a final decision. And that brings us to the big question. Is this just another threat, or are these tariffs here to stay? How will the rest of the world respond? What kind of impact would a 30% tariff have on the European Union? What's Trump's ultimate goal? That's exactly what we're going to break down in this video. With Trump, news moves so fast, it's hard to keep track of everything. So let's do a quick recap of the tariffs on Europe. When the Republicans first took the White House, the US was still playing by the rules of the World Trade Organization. That meant applying the same tariffs to all countries that didn't have a free trade agreement with the US. Of course, there were specific products with higher tariffs. And if you remember the trade war with China, you're probably thinking of 1,000 exceptions to that rule. But that's what they were, exceptions. However, on April 2nd, the so-called Liberation Day, everything took a 180-degree turn. Trump had already spent a few days ignoring free trade agreements, even the ones he had signed himself, to impose tariffs on Canada and Mexico. But on Liberation Day, he declared a full-blown trade war on the entire world. Every country got slapped with a new tariff, even the ones only inhabited by penguins. Don't think that Trump's team spent much time crunching the numbers to come up with an optimal tariff, not at all. They simply took the trade deficit, divided it by total imports, and because they're so generous, they cut that number in half. Oh, and they also set a minimum tariff of 10%, just to make sure even countries with a trade deficit with the US still got punished. Trump treated the European Union as a single bloc, and since it runs a pretty large trade surplus with Uncle Sam, it ended up getting hit with a 20% tariff. Now, here's something really important. Trump only looked at the surplus in goods trade, not in services, where the US actually sells a lot more than it buys. Keep that in mind, because it's going to be important later on. However, these tariffs didn't last long. In just 1 week, Trump replaced the system with a flat 10% tariff on all countries. Well, all except China, but we'll leave that aside for now. So what was the reason behind this move? Well, technically, Trump didn't replace the tariffs, he just paused them temporarily for 90 days. The idea was that during those 3 months, other countries would line up to negotiate a trade deal with the US.
And don't let some of these politicians go around saying, because I'm telling you, these countries are calling us up, kissing my ass. They are dying to make a deal. Please, sir, make a deal. I'll do anything, sir.
Unfortunately for the American president, that's just not true. As of today, the US has only reached trade deals with the UK, Vietnam, and China. The deal with the UK changes virtually nothing. The one with Vietnam barely includes any concrete proposals, and its legal status is still unclear. And as for the deal with China, well, let's not even go there. It was a massive humiliation for the US. And as if that weren't enough, the trade panel of judges struck down the universal 30% tariff. Because here's the thing we haven't told you yet. None of this was done with congressional approval. It's all been pushed through using executive orders. However, the appeals panel reinstated the tariffs, at least temporarily, until the courts decide whether or not they're constitutional. We should get an update on this legal case by July 31st, just one day before Trump's deadline to strike new trade deals. In any case, the 90-day grace period came and went, and nothing happened. Technically, the tariffs announced on Liberation Day were supposed to kick in on July 9th, but Trump pushed the start date back by another 20 days. The rest of the story you probably already know. Just a few days ago, Ursula von der Leyen received a letter that hit Brussels like a bomb. No one saw it coming. The US is now threatening the European Union with a 30% tariff. And remember, the Liberation Day tariff was only 20%, which was already outrageous. The worst part, it looked like both sides were actually close to reaching a deal. At first, the EU proposed a 0-for-0 plan, eliminating all tariffs between the two blocs. Of course, that was just a bluff. A move like that would require unanimous approval. And the last time the US and Europe tried to negotiate a free trade deal, the streets of several European countries erupted in protests. Sure, protesting might be a national pastime in France, but it gives you an idea of just how hard reaching a deal like that would be. Still, there were other more realistic agreements within reach.
US offers EU 10% tariff deal with caveats.
Sure, 10% is already a lot, but now Trump is threatening a tariff 3 times higher. And I know what you're all probably wondering. What kind of impact could such a massive trade tax actually have? Well, we're about to find out. But just to give you a sense of how extreme this is, not a single publication we've reviewed had considered a scenario like this. Still, the Peterson Institute came up with a pretty close estimate, assuming a 25% tariff, and that Europe strikes back with equal measures. As you can see, no one comes out ahead. In the short term, US GDP drops by more than 0.2%, and in the long run, it levels off at negative 0.1%. Overall, the outlook is even worse for European countries. Germany's GDP drops by 0.4% in the short term and 1.5% over the long run. And here's the kicker. Even though Germany is the export powerhouse of the old continent, the forecasts are even more pessimistic for the rest of the Eurozone. Of course, predicting exactly what's going to happen is extremely difficult, but this gives us a rough idea. That said, some economists are even more pessimistic. For example, a study commissioned by the European Parliament found that a trade war with just 10% tariffs could shrink Europe's GDP by over 1 full point in the short term, and the negative effects don't ease much over time. That would be a much worse scenario than the one we mentioned earlier, even though the tariffs are 2.5 times lower. To be fair, there are also more optimistic studies estimating that 20% tariffs would shave off just 0.2 points of GDP. After all, only 21% of EU exports go to the US, and their value-added accounts for just 2.9% of total GDP. So in short, no one really knows what's going to happen. What we do know is that these tariffs are going to hurt. Honestly, it wouldn't be surprising if Germany ends up in a recession because of the United States. Then again, it's also possible that nothing will happen. Now we're looking at yet another case of taco. Trump always chickens out. Remember, on the 9th of April, he delayed the Liberation Day tariffs until July 9th. And then on July 9th, he did it again, pushing the deadline to the 1st of August. The strategy is clear. Crank up the pressure to strike a deal. But come on, if there was already a good faith deal on the table, threatening the other side doesn't exactly seem like the smartest way to negotiate, especially considering that the Trump administration doesn't have a single solid trade deal to brag about. Trump may think he holds all the cards, but trade wars are notoriously hard to win. Europe could redirect its exports away from the US toward other countries, or even keep the goods within the EU to drive prices down. Sure, that's not as good as trading freely with the US, but it would help cushion the blow. And let's not forget, the EU has its own tools to push back against Uncle Sam.
The European Union has a commercial bazooka ready if a tariff war with Trump breaks out. Here's how the anti-coercion instrument works.
Remember when we said earlier that the US runs a trade deficit with Europe in goods, but a surplus in services? Well, that's exactly where Europe can hit back the hardest, and they already have tools to do it. One of them is the ACI, the Anti-Coercion Instrument. It's a set of measures designed to punish countries that engage in economic bullying against any EU member state. So far, it's only been used against China, but more and more voices in Brussels are calling to use it against the US too. So what exactly is this trade bazooka? Well, among other things, it includes scrapping intellectual property protections, meaning European companies could copy American ones without facing legal consequences inside the EU. It could also block American financial system investments in European markets. And it doesn't stop there. It even allows the EU to freeze the profits that big tech companies earn in Europe, stopping them from sending that money back to the US. Basically, it's like a mix between the frozen Russian assets following the invasion of Ukraine and the infamous Argentine-style capital controls. Just a few days before Trump's letter arrived, Europe actually put on hold a proposal to hike taxes on big tech firms. Remember, unfortunately, none of them are European. Now, who knows? Maybe that proposal will be back on the table. The US is a major exporter of two things: financial assets and tech services, so it makes sense that Europe's response would focus on those two sectors. And let's not forget about the more traditional countermeasures. According to a document published back in April, the EU could respond with tariffs ranging from 10% to 25%, targeting goods worth around 21 billion euros, with the option to raise that number to 70 billion if needed. But there's one thing we need to make very clear. Trump's trade war has mostly hurt the US itself. And let's not kid ourselves, Europe would be the biggest loser if it did go ahead with these countermeasures. For example, European companies rely on American software to operate. There's no such thing as German Google. These countermeasures will only be useful if they help secure a better trade deal. If not, well, it'll just be a self-inflicted wound that makes everything worse. Now, the real question is, how far is Donald Trump willing to go? Will there be a taco or not? You know, Trump always chickens out. We don't know for sure, but maybe copper can give us a clue. Country-specific tariffs weren't enough for the Republican president, so now he's gone after raw materials too. He's already done it with steel and aluminium, but now he's slapped a brand new 50% tariff on copper, and that has sent copper prices soaring to record highs. For example, copper futures on the New York Stock Exchange jumped 13% in a single day, the biggest one-day surge since 1969. The United States imports only about 60% of the copper it consumes, and not because it lacks copper in its mines. In fact, the country is quite rich in copper, but extracting and processing it domestically can cost up to 3 times more than just importing it, especially from Chile, which supplies most of the US's copper imports. Since returning to power, Trump has signed multiple executive orders to speed up mining permits, but clearly that's not enough for him. He now wants to boost domestic production through tariffs. The idea is a disaster. Back when President Bush imposed much smaller tariffs on steel, the aluminium industry added about 1,000 jobs, but the rest of the economy ended up losing 75,000 jobs because input costs skyrocketed. But the funniest part, steel production actually dropped in the long run, so the tariffs ended up doing the exact opposite of what they were supposed to do. And what's worse, their negative effects lasted more than a decade. Even though the tariffs were only in place for a couple of years, it was a complete disaster. And the same thing is bound to happen with copper. Trump argues that boosting domestic production is a matter of national security. After all, copper is the second most used metal in the defense sector. But as we explained in our video about steel and aluminium tariffs, that argument doesn't really hold up, especially when your main supplier is Chile, a friendly country right there on the same continent. The Visualeconomik community, we're not just bringing up copper just to debate whether this tariff is a good idea or not. The key here is that tariffs create a price gap. Copper ends up being worth something different inside the country than outside it, and that price gap gives us a clue as to whether the market believes Trump will back down or not.
On Wednesday, U.S. prices for the metal on COMEX were down slightly at $5.53 a pound, a 28% premium to the global benchmark LME price. That level of premium, well below the 50% tariff proposed, reflects market uncertainty about whether and how Trump would implement any levies.
Put simply, copper futures should be 50% more expensive in the US compared to the rest of the world, but right now, they're only about 28% higher. Why? Because traders still believe there's roughly a 50-50 chance that Trump will walk back the tariff, so copper prices might not rise much compared to global levels. It's not much, but this is probably the best estimate we've got on what the Republican president is really planning. Not perfect, but hey, better than nothing. And of course, Trump walking back the copper tariff doesn't mean he'll cancel the 30% tariff on Europe or any of the other tariffs he's slapped on the countries around the world. But let's keep in mind, none of us have a crystal ball. That's why we'll be keeping a close eye on this and keeping you updated. Just remember, August 1st is the new D-Day. Now it's your turn. What do you think? How much damage could these steep tariffs cause to European markets? Will the United States and Europe reach a deal by August 1st? And if they do, will it actually be better than what we had before Trump returned to the White House? Let us know your comments down below. And don't forget, here on Visualeconomik, we publish new videos every week, so hit that subscribe button if you haven't already so you don't miss a thing. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like, and we'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.